Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony imaging ambassador and I'd like to talk to you about the passion I've had for photography over my 40-year career. Now, there is an old saying for photography about mirrors and windows. Certainly photography has been a window to the world for me, but it's also acted as a mirror, so to help me think about what it is that I'm actually exploring and seeing. Now, photography for me started way back when I graduated in 1980. My last project at college was to document the lives of the working coal miners in the Rhondda Valley in South Wales. I lived with these miners for 6 weeks, even going down the mines with them, and I documented every aspect of their work. I was not breaking any new ground with this style of photography. This had basically been established years and years before I started. If you looked at the work of the photographers of the FSA, Farm Securities Administration, documenting the Depression in the USA, this really established how comprehensive a documentary project can be about the lives of people. There is another photography that's also inspired me. This is the work of W. Eugene Smith, and one of his most famous projects was in a place called Minamata in Japan, and he documented the lives of these people being poisoned by a local factory. This is about to be a feature film in 2020. It may have been delayed because of the pandemic we're suffering at the moment, but keep an eye out for this one because it should be an eye-opener for many people who are looking to get into this style of photography. The first piece of advice I can give to any photographer who's looking to maintain their passion in photography is use your interests that are outside of photography as the fuel, if you like, to drive the photography interest itself. Now, in my late teenage era and my 20s, I had a keen interest in motorcycles, and this actually led me to start creating photo documentaries and narratives using my motorcycle as the vehicle, if you like, to go out and explore the world. Now, I also had an interest in reading stories about adventurers going around the world, whether it's using motorcycles or boats or trains, and so this sort of helped me focus my own interests and how I wanted to create stories that would be of interest to other people. And obviously these appeared in magazines during the 1980s and 1990s. Now, we'll jump forward a number of years now. It's 2012. I've been teaching for some time as well as writing for magazines, and now I'm picked up as a Sony ambassador. One of my first projects was to work in the Northern Territories in some indigenous communities with a UNICEF photographer called Giacomo Perozzi, and I was just documenting him working with the children. Basically, little Sony compact cameras were given to the children, and they were asked then to create narratives or stories about their own lives on the indigenous community. So this gave me a great opportunity not only just to document the children and Giacomo Perozzi, but also start taking photographs of the elders and the community itself. I always believe that we have to basically look to our left and our right to sort of document what is around that story. And certainly I'm not looking for individual hero images. I'm looking for pieces of a jigsaw puzzle to help people understand the bigger picture, if you like. So nothing is off limits, whether it's children outside of the project, babies, broken toys on the ground, inviting children to show me maybe their pet dogs, etc. Everything is up for grabs, if you like. To give you an example, this is Lissa, and she allowed me to photograph her over an extended period of time. So it's not just this one grab shot. I chatted to her about her life on the community, and she allowed me great access to document her in a number of different locations actually on the community. And so this builds up a more personal connection with the people I'm photographing, and I'm always careful to ask their name so I don't misrepresent them when I actually start publishing these stories. And so a lot of this work went forward as a video piece as well for UNICEF, because the children had their work exhibited at Parliament House in Canberra, and my work was also used in that exhibition to document the children who were then documenting their own lives. Now, if you don't have the opportunity to either exhibit your work or publish your work, there's always the opportunity to create photo books. Many of the apps now, whether it be online or in programs like Lightroom, which has a book module, we can put these images together to create a narrative that we could never get from just looking at a single hero image. Now, my work is also used to illustrate advertisements for Sony Australia, and one of the pieces of copy that accompanied one of the adverts, and I didn't write it, was the words "tread lightly, experience everything and forget nothing." I thought those were quite clever words, but I just wanted to fine-tune those words slightly, and what I brought it down to, which was more personal to me, was look intensely, experience everything and expect nothing. Don't go in there expecting to find any one thing. Always keep an open mind, and so that you can record things that are unexpected that you find on the way. So my advice again for when you're going out into maybe experiencing things for the very first time is I'm always looking for 4 types of shots that will help me build the big picture. So we have something called the establishing shot. Imagine how many times you've watched a Hollywood movie where it's a long shot, maybe of New York coming in via helicopter. And this establishing shot sets the scene, if you like. We now know that the characters we'll see in the next scene are basically working in New York or living in New York. We then have what I call is the activity shot. What are the protagonists doing? What are the characters doing in this? Are they fishing? Are they hunting? What exactly is it that they're doing? Then we have portrait shots. These are often the key shots, especially having a background working in editorial. The stories really come alive if we look at the main characters in that story, and so that often means getting in quite close to some of the people we're photographing to reveal their character and their emotions. And then finally, the detail shot. We have to get really close to some of the fine details that may be too small in the broader shots, so we can work out exactly what is happening. So to give you some examples, I'm going up to Alaska. Now, the primary reason to go to Alaska at this time of the year, which is in August, is to photograph the bears fishing for salmon. The salmon are in the runs, they're on the rivers, going up to lay their eggs, etc. And so there's going to be a lot of bears to photograph. But this is me stepping outside of the hotel on Wrangel Island the first morning, and this for me is like a Gregory Crewdson-esque shot, if you like. It gives a real flavour of the town that I'm staying in Alaska, and the bears will be pretty much meaningless unless I can position them into the environment that I'm also experiencing. So this is the where in the story, where this might also be somewhat slightly unusual shots. This town that I'm staying in is basically a fishing town, and so getting some aspects of that fishing culture, if you like, whether it just be this fishing boat that's sort of mothballed for whatever reason, it gives you a sort of a flavour of what the town is there to serve. Getting in a little bit closer, looking at some of the buildings. I obviously get a hard time during the Alaskan winters, and showing the character and texture of the town by going in just that little bit closer. We also have the opportunity of going inside some of the buildings. Now, not everybody would think a laundromat is photo worthy, but for people who have not seen these type of laundromats in a fishing village, industrial sized laundries, then you're going to get another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Also going into the local pub, and obviously the walls are adorned with hunting trophies, and this is just by the billiard table, and somebody's hung up the triangle on one of the stag antlers here, so we can get a feel of some of the quirky sides of Alaskan life. And here we have the what. This is the activity shots. Somebody working with the nets on one of their fishing boats after it's come back into dock in the early morning. Also, I'm documenting the guides who are actually leading me to the bears. This is Brenda. She's just taking time out with her dog. She's got three of her loves of her life with her there. She's got her gun, her coffee, and her dog who's wearing that red bandana, so it's not mistaken as a wolf, and becomes part of the hunted. So we get a nice sort of a character shot there of one of my guides that I'm spending some extended periods of time with during my trip. This is another one of the guides who's bringing up the rear of the party. We usually got an armed guard in the front and one trailing up behind, and what we're looking at now is taking time out to pose for me, but I'm getting in much closer now just to show you can see the size of the ammunition that is actually used if it ever is needed to stop a bear that is charging towards us. So it's only that level of detail that gives you a real idea of what this Alaskan adventure is about. And I'm actually holding back the bears, which is the primary reason we're there, just to show you there's a whole narrative or story that surrounds the primary task of being there. This is one of the hero landscape shots. Some photographers only bother showing the hero shots, and I think sometimes that weakens the strength of some of these hero landscapes if we don't see the little pieces of the adventure that surround this hero shot. So I'm always in favor of promoting narratives, sequences of images that could go into a book or a magazine article or an exhibition, rather than the single hero image that you then measure its worth by the number of likes you get on social media. So to give you an idea about expectations and reality, now this is certainly a fabulous location. It's Mesa Arch in Canyonlands in USA, and this is just a minute after dawn, and I'm just hiding the edge of that sun behind the arch there just to get that starburst really breaking out now. Now a lot of people will go to these locations because they've seen these hero images, but the reality is something altogether different. So what I would just like to do is just drop that shot in, and so either side of me there'll be many photographers all vying for position. The window of opportunity is very short to get the sun just clipping the arch or the horizon line, so there's a bit of a feeding frenzy around this, and so generally what we're looking at in the photograph is something different to the reality of actually photographing this. Another example might be such as the torii gates in outside of Kyoto in Japan. We might see these hero shots and put this on our bucket list of somewhere we absolutely need to go to get this fabulous shot. When I posted this image online, a lot of people said, where are the tourists, Mark? Because I was there and it was absolutely crowded, and it does become exceptionally crowded. So this was just after dawn. Most tourists are still in their hotels having breakfast. So I'm capturing this with very few people who have made their way to the torii gates at the moment. And even then you have to sort of work with the few people who are there not to walk into your shot. So you can grab the shot and then you thank them and then they walk in. So timing is absolutely everything. Now I've got nothing against these type of shots, but if I only captured these type of shots, I would feel altogether different about my photography. So I would promote that we shoot more than just for the likes, just more than just the hero shots themselves. This is my local hero shot. It's Princess Pier in Port Melbourne, and when you go at sunset in summer, you typically will find at least another dozen photographers who are there to capture the colourful sky above this or the pins or the old pier that we can see in the foreground there. It's a bit like the terracotta warriors looking out, but this time over a seascape. So it is a great shot, but I would also go to the same location in pouring rain when there are no other photographers there, because this is another aspect of Princess Pier that a lot of people don't think is photo worthy. It's where we can sort of reveal another side of this location. And we're looking up the channel there to the left in the rain. It's so misty and rainy that we can just barely make out the horizon line. And for me, I actually prefer this image of this pier to the previous one, which is typically the one you see if you search this as a hero location. So what I like to describe these hero shots and why some people may lose their passion for photography is I believe it's inconsistent positive reinforcement, i.e. we go out many times and sometimes we might have to drive hours or even fly interstate or fly internationally to find these locations, but they're very much weather dependent and we might come back empty-handed, and we also may not be doing them that often. So the opportunities to get a positive reinforcement from our photography are few and far between. So another aspect of photography which I also think is inconsistent positive reinforcement is when we work with paid models to pose for us. It involves maybe carrying large amounts of lighting gear, setting up. Sometimes a model may not show. Sometimes we don't get exactly what we want. It's all a bit fraught. We don't actually enjoy the experience that much if you're not used to handling large amounts of gear and interacting with models. So yes, the final outcome might get lots of likes on Instagram or Facebook, but how much did we actually enjoy the shoot itself? So what I'm going to give you some ideas for is some more ideas for consistent positive reinforcement. For instance, most people will live quite near a dog park, or I live just one block back from the beach, and each morning at dawn there'll be some dog owners who are running their dogs to give them good exercise. And most dog owners will be overjoyed if you want to photograph their dogs. And what I do is I just I share my details with the owner of the dog, and so that I can send some photographs of their dog running, and they're more than pleased. I usually get back a wow, thank you, and that itself is a positive reinforcement for what I've done. And a lot of the dog owners will work with me as well. They'll throw the ball towards me, so I get the dogs running towards me, or the dog owner will stand behind my shoulder, so when the dogs return with the ball, they're coming towards me. So, and I can pretty much do this on any morning, rain or shine. And so this is a great way of getting out more than once a week, or even more than once a fortnight, and going out multiple times a week and getting that positive reinforcement. And there is one of my hero shots, and I've got hundreds of them, a dog running at full blast. A lot of dog owners who only have their smartphones just don't have these images of their hero dogs, these athletic creatures running at full blast. I love the shallow water in these instances, but they can look just as good in long grass in a park as well. I was recently flown over to Vietnam to do an advert for Sony Singapore. And I spent every opportunity standing on street corners whilst waiting for a coffee just to photograph the scooters and motorcycles passing me. And believe me, there's no shortage of them in a city like Ho Chi Minh. We can just see these just like passing every 5 seconds or even more. And this is a great opportunity to practice my slow shutter speed panning techniques. And it's a great way. I haven't got waves from the people passing, never any negative comments from me photographing these people passing. You'll see many of them are blowing me a kiss or waving at me as they pass. And I've got this one here, one of my hero shots of these children returning from school with their mum, and a couple of the children eyeballing me on the back of this scooter, and some lovely motion blur. And this was whilst waiting to do a film clip for one of the adverts. So I'm not just there for the hero shot, I'm there for all of the shots in between the hero shots. One of the ways to maybe practice some of these skills, for instance, is just start looking at events that are happening around you. Sometimes you might not be able to get media passes for sporting events. Even I find that quite challenging to get that. But during the summer season here in Melbourne, there's always triathlons going, and sometimes I don't have to travel very far for them. So I can just sit on the beach. There's no need to have a media pass. It's a public event, and I can sort of fine-tune my skills, test a new lens, test a new camera with people who can get reasonably close to me. I don't even need a 600mm focal length. I can usually shoot these with a 200mm lens. And this practice, this regular practice, has given me excellent skills for doing things that are altogether more challenging, such as photographing this vulture in full flight here. So what I'm learning is a transferable skill set, whether I'm practicing on the little scooters in Vietnam or people in doing public sporting events. I'm getting those skills that I can then use for things that don't happen quite so frequently. So, and I've used those skills that when I do get a media pass and I go to maybe this MotoGP, and this is the world champion Marc Marquez, this is a very small crop, so I'm having to pan with him with a 400mm f2.8 lens, incredibly fast pan, because this is one of the fastest corners on the circuit. And so I'm got a slightly high vantage point here, so I'm putting you in the rider's seat, but my skill set has been learnt on something much altogether much more simple, such as things that are close by my home. So you'll probably know that I have a broad base of what I shoot because of that editorial background, where you're not focusing just on one thing. You're photographing the locations, the activity shots, the portraits, the details. This does mean that I do have to switch groups of settings very quickly. I do have my own personal workflow, which I've basically put into a video tutorial on YouTube called Memory Mastermind, and you'll find that I can quite quickly change between groups of settings using the memory feature on the shoot mode dial on the top of the camera. If I was shooting, changing between the landscapes and portraits or action shots very quickly, and I was not using the memories, I think I would lose many more shots than I currently lose, just because I would forget one of the settings to dial in. Let me talk to you now about something called the road less traveled. We've looked at those hero locations that where X marks the spot. This is where you need to be at this time of day, and then you get the shot. And Instagram has certainly overloaded or overpopulated some of those hero locations, because absolutely everybody knows the GPS coordinates of where they actually are. But there's many more opportunities to have more enjoyable experience by taking this road less traveled. As we're in Death Valley now, this is also a popular spot for photographers. Now I'm in I just parked the transit vehicle now, and a lot of the photographers who are the attendees on one of the workshops that I'm running have headed towards something called Golden Canyon, which is sort of over my shoulder. The expectation is the canyon is the fabulous thing that we need to be photographing, but as soon as I looked over my shoulder when we got out of the vehicle, I realized the fabulous thing was possibly behind me as well. This is just the junction, so to the car park itself. But we were getting some serious drama in the sky there, and I certainly have a little bit of love for these stop signs in America. Just that big splash of red in a clear blue sky certainly gives me some drama that I'm looking for. And I'm not looking for a completely natural landscape all of the time. I'm more than happy to put some man-made elements into that landscape, because for me, photography, if I'm going to be truthful about what it is I'm experiencing, I'm going to put in the bad with the good, show you everything that I'm experiencing. Now, one of my favourite landscapes that I know X doesn't mark the spot. This is the sand dunes in Death Valley, and it's a well-visited spot, but I can pretty much guarantee the spot where I'm standing to take this shot probably doesn't exist, because the sand dune has moved down the road somewhere. These are very slow-moving waves, if you like, and so I actually like photographing these because people will never replicate this exact shot. We all have a little dot on the top of one of those sand dunes there. That's a human figure. I actually like placing a very small human figure in some of these landscapes. I won't actually often clone them out or wait for that figure to disappear, and I actually don't mind the footsteps on the sand dune leading up towards that figure. I think it's evidence that these sand dunes are frequented by humans looking for those perfect photographs. Again, we've got the sand dunes in the distance. I like to think that those footsteps on those sand dunes in the middle distance aren't what's drawing your attention. What I'd like to think is drawing your attention in this shot is also something very ephemeral, something that is probably not there now, which are just these branches emerging from the sand dune in the foreground, and that becomes my key element of this landscape. I often find natural landscapes quite challenging because there is no clear defined focal point for the image, and so that often is the challenge for me in these more natural landscapes. And for people who are looking at my Death Valley shots here in Australia and they're saying, well, that's okay for you, Mark, you got to go over to Death Valley. I don't have that opportunity to travel so far afield, so I decided to put in some fabulous sand dunes much closer to home. Now, this is 2 hours north of an Australian city called Perth, a place called Cervantes, and so these things can be accessed quite closer to home. And if you want to get that very early morning light, I would go there the day before, get some pitch a tent or get a motel room so you can be at these places at the last light of day and the first light of day. To give you an idea of that road less travelled and some ways of communicating landscape which are atypical. This one is a good shot that influenced the way that I actually wanted to photograph the Australian landscape, what often is referred to as the bush, in a little more. I wanted to be able to focus and draw people's attention to what the Australian bush feels like for people who haven't experienced it. And one of the things for me, because I was British by birth, is the Australian bush is almost impenetrable sometimes. We don't have these little paths walking through these little woods, looking for maybe Pooh Bear and piglets to arrive. These are actually quite dangerous places where often people have never walked. And so I'm on my way to a vantage point where I can see a big panoramic spread from a place called Mount Buffalo. But for me, this was the hero shot. We're not actually at the vantage point yet, but I actually like the impenetrable nature of what we're looking at here. A bushfire has obviously travelled through this landscape in a previous year, and so it's on the road to recovery. But what we have are these stripped bare white tree trunks which have been, the foliage has disappeared because of the fire, but we can see the new foliage just at ground level starting to emerge. So it's a story about danger but also rebirth. So this has led me to capture Australian landscapes more and more using atypical methods. Now, this particular location, I don't even probably know where it is anymore because my the GPS data had disappeared. I'm so off the beaten track. I'm actually on a boat going in Tasmania, going along the shoreline of the Gordon River here, and so these landscapes are slowly unfolding. The boat's moving very slowly, so I do have the opportunity to frame up these landscapes. But what I've decided to do is restrict the number of elements that we're actually seeing. The typical way of that most people construct or design a landscape is with a ultra wide angle lens, maybe ND filters to darken the sky. We have foreground, middle distance and distance. This actually breaks all of the rules. We have no sky, we have no foreground. The perspective is completely flattened because I'm using my 400 millimeter telephoto zoom, usually at the longer telephoto reach. And so I'm stripping the elements down to just the forest and the rocks which are on the edge of the water. And if I do clip any sky or or any water in the foreground, I basically crop it out. To show you an example of here, I have the water in the foreground, but I think that's one element too many for me. I'm really trying just to restrict this. In these particular images of landscapes, I also realize I'm actually not trying to find a focal point like we saw in Death Valley with those branches emerging from the foreground sand dune. I'm just stripping it down to almost flattened perspective, texture. It's almost like pattern, but it does communicate something quite special for me and very personal for me about how I actually see the Australian bush. And as I say, I've got many of these. And the great things about these landscapes is you will never find this particular landscape because there are thousands of kilometres of these unfolding landscapes around the Australian coastline and along rivers, all slightly unique. And having that slightly unique shot in your folio is quite special. I think it's you not going and collecting these hero landscapes to get likes on Facebook or Instagram. I also think that building up a pattern, this image is a pattern, but also by including it in many images that also communicate a very similar thing, the message is strengthened by numbers. And as I said, here is another one. So you're getting an idea of how I actually want to communicate just by the repetition. And this is where you've got maybe a gallery exhibition or a chapter in a book to show that something you've observed and how you're communicating this is quite personal to you. So going away from the Australian bush, I was in Japan in April last year, and I was taken by a friend to a bamboo forest, not one of the famous bamboo forests in Japan, but just a bamboo forest. And I found this quite challenging to photograph, and I didn't immediately respond to this because I was looking almost like for a way in. It does have that impenetrable feel that was very similar to the Australian bush. Here I'm just, my attention is drawn to a little pink ribbon that is just to the one side. I wanted to make that quite subtle and not put it in the center of the frame, so it's almost like you don't notice it straight away. You're sort of drawn to it as the second thing that you see. And but what I actually found was by trying to photograph it over and over again, I actually managed to communicate what I wanted to communicate about the bamboo forest, and this is more accurately communicated by this approach, basically where I remove the background altogether, so I just have bamboo with very small glimpses of either sky or foliage just poking through. So this was just a way of playing with the focal length of the lens, my own distance, and the framing itself, my own vantage point to the subject matter. Another photographer might approach this same bamboo forest in an altogether different manner. This was a different bamboo area, this time in Tokyo, but this one I approached it with an 85mm prime lens at maximum aperture, and so this was a way of pulling out small details in the bamboo forest and then letting the rest of the bamboo forest tip to bokeh. I actually prefer the previous one, but I'm just showing you here there's an alternative inroad into communicating things in different ways, and this is where the mirror part of photography, we talked about windows and mirrors, and this is where the mirror aspect of what I'm discussing comes into play. Let's look at urban landscapes now, the typical classic urban landscapes that people will respond to positively on Instagram and Facebook is a shot like this. I'm actually staying in the Langham Hotel in Melbourne, even though I live in Melbourne, and the reason for that, these hotel rooms have the perfect view looking out over the central business district across the river and across the Flinders Street station in the foreground there. And so this is the perfect time of day as well for that classic blue, orange complementary colours that I've captured here with some good clouds in the sky. But to be honest, this does doesn't actually communicate what I feel about urban life in this quite congested city of more than 3 million people. And so this is more accurately communicated in cityscapes that I've captured in places like Hong Kong. This is captured again with that telephoto lens, and again it flattens perspective, again it compresses everything, so it gives you that crowded, condensed feel that the previous landscape doesn't give you. So this is certainly a more accurate way for me, or truthful way, that I can try and communicate my feelings towards Hong Kong, which certainly feels a lot more crowded than the city that I live in. And to give you more examples, and this is a way of, again, there's no hero vantage point, X marks the spot. You could come back maybe with 100 of these landscapes to communicate this same feeling that you have towards this cityscape. And to show you something in a different city this time, Singapore, using the same technique, I managed to get onto the same vantage point without having to point the camera up or down, by using the upper deck of a double-decker bus in Singapore. It's basically just a tourist bus, but it's put me on the same level as this hotel car park with this vertical garden. And this said a lot to me about Singapore, because the foliage and the parks and the flowers was certainly a signature key element, as well as the concrete in a city like Singapore. So this was a way that I could communicate this aspect of Singapore, using the same technique again, telephoto lens, compression, no sky, no foreground. Again, I often thought about Singapore, there's so much air conditioning in Singapore, wouldn't it be easier just to put a dome over the whole city and air condition the island? But the reality is every room needs an air conditioner because of the 99% humidity. And so we're looking at, if you look at maybe a back street in Singapore, you see the actual requirements to keep Singapore, the humidity under control for a lot of people inside. So, and for viewing this again on a level perspective now, we're looking at, from my hotel, looking out at another slightly older building here, looking at all of the dotted air conditioning units over an apartment block in the distance there, and creating this very geometric pattern as a way that adds to that communication. Subtly different from the other two images of Singapore, but each piece is a piece of the jigsaw puzzle that adds to maybe a big landscape hero shot of Singapore itself. And again, once you've started collecting these, and I talk about collections for photographers, and this is a way of driving passion and keeping motivation alive, is photographers are like stamp collectors, if you like, is we need to find sequences or series of images that we're drawn to, and then keep on adding over an extended period of time. So once you've got a great collection or maybe urban landscapes and you feel like you want to communicate that, again, the photographic book is an excellent way of putting that all together. The double page spread in a photo book is an excellent tool for putting images alongside each other, and if done well, the images will strengthen the communication of its neighbor. Another thing, that if you're working out how to get positive reinforcement from the images you're taking, one of the ways that I do this personally is I put images up into an online resource. For me, this is Flickr, and I upload 4K ultra high definition images. That's 3,840 pixels wide, which is exactly the same resolution as my large 4K TV. And then on the smart TVs that are running the Android operating system, we can actually get these TVs then to use this folio as a screensaver. The point I'm about to make now is I referred to earlier when I was showing you my Alaska images, and my first image was just after I stepped out of the hotel on Wrangel Island, and that is about not having expectations about your trips. So a lot of photographers don't get their cameras out of the camera bags until they've arrived at the location where the photography is about to take place. So the next couple of images I'm going to show you are images that I take pride of place in my folio, but actually are on the way to the scenic location. For instance, I'm waiting to board a train to go to Venice, so I'm in Milan waiting for that train, and I'm already noticing photographic opportunities. My daughter was actually sitting between this couple, so I beckoned her to come over, and then the interaction between the two people left on this seat was amazing. I really liked that distance between them and the look that the woman is giving the man reading his newspaper, even down to the point of the pigeon also looking at the man reading the newspaper, and that classic strong architecture of the train station in Milan also creates a very powerful image for me. Much closer to home, here I'm waiting to go off on a photography workshop interstate, and I'm waiting for my plane to start boarding, and I'm noticing the character with his coffee just over the way from me, and what I'm drawn to is his feet carrying maybe a little bit of tension or maybe a little bit of impatience waiting for the plane. And so just that little notice is, for me, is an opportunity to take almost like a street photography style, but this time inside of the airport itself. So this section I've called "Are We There Yet?" So this shot, I was just playing around with a 10-stop ND filter that I just had delivered that morning for one of the lenses that I owned. So I'm going to the university where I'm about to teach, and I put the 10-stop ND filter on my lens, and then I'm just starting to take 2-second exposures outside of the train window. I have no idea whether these images will be useful, but it actually led to a whole series that I started doing, and the underlying theory of that is to take pictures whilst I'm moving. This particular picture in Dubai, this is the tallest building that I'm taking a picture of. I don't have the top of the building, it's just a 35mm focal length I'm using, but I'm on a travelator going along, and this is just a 2-second exposure, and I particularly like the colors and the drama that's created by this motion blur, if you like. They're reasonably abstract images, I give you that, and it's not everybody is going to respond to these, but I certainly spent many months creating these abstracts of color, line and shape. These are the markings on the airport, again looking out of the window with a 2-second exposure as I'm walking past the window. This is whilst I'm waiting to catch the bullet train. The bullet train is just about to arrive to take me to the next city in Japan, and an army of these cleaners usually appear just a minute before the train arrives. They're going to jump onto the train, turn the seats around if necessary, clean everything spick and span before everybody gets on the train. And so this was a great opportunity with an 85mm prime IAF helping me work very easily there. Shooting slightly from the hip here in this particular instance allows me to collect these portraits, and this for me is a great memory of my train travels in Japan. This time again at a different station. Here the trains are pretty much always on time, but it doesn't stop some of the guards checking that the train is on time, and so this was a key point because when you explain to anybody about the punctuality of trains in Japan, this is an important piece of that jigsaw puzzle. So you're looking at photographs to basically speak for you about what it is that you want to tell people. And this is me on the bullet train. We're traveling probably 300 kilometers an hour now, so I'm actually using my action settings to photograph what is a landscape. A lot of people do these great shots of Mount Fuji, and it shows you maybe the blossom in the foreground, maybe there's a lake in the foreground, and it's very serene, tranquil location. So I wanted something altogether a little bit different, so I've captured Mount Fuji at 300 kilometers an hour. And the city Fuji itself is an industrial city. We only have to look at Fuji film to know that it is an area of an industrialized area in Japan. So putting that industry in the foreground in front of Mount Fuji for me was a way of telling more about Mount Fuji than just the mountain itself. This wasn't taken with one of my alpha cameras. It goes back to me using a 10-stop ND filter, just trying things that are a bit of left of center, if you like. Try experimenting with your camera gear. This was me using my iPhone in panorama mode. And seriously, you can't shoot a panorama that will stitch seamlessly when you're traveling at 300 kilometers an hour, but it doesn't stop the iPhone software from attempting to do this. And often what you get back is something that is completely unusable, but every so often you get something that is quite visually interesting. When I did post this, somebody asked me what I was thinking when I shot this, because it is even a little bit unusual for the sort of photographs that I tend to post online. But I'm really just trying to get you an idea that before you arrive at the location, there's lots of opportunities just to keep your eyes peeled, experiment with your camera gear, try something you haven't tried before in order to get something that might drive you in a completely new direction. Again, I was running a photography workshop in the United States last year, and we were going to a dam. Now, we actually stopped very near the dam itself, much too close to get the classic dam shot, which you typically need to be at a distance from. But my favorite shots of the dam were, again, like my cityscapes. They're detail shots, and you need like 50 detail shots to build the bigger picture of what is important and what is interesting at the dam itself. So even down to the little parked cars, the little shed in the lower left image there. A guy used to come out on this little golfing buggy. I think it looks like a golfing buggy. Couldn't quite work out what he was doing, driving around and around in circles before he disappeared back into the shadows. But it was certainly part of the story, the narrative of being close to this dam. So let's go in and show you some of my extended stories where more than one image is needed to tell the story itself. So one of my what I thought was one of my most powerful stories, and one of the stories that was challenging for me to capture both emotionally and technically, was in the city where I captured this image of this wristwatch, which had stopped at 8:15. It actually stopped on August the 6th, 1945, and if you know your history, you'll have a clear idea, as well as looking at the damage on the watch, what actually happened to stop this watch in its tracks. And that is the first atomic explosion in Hiroshima. Now, there is an obelisk in a side street. It's not in a main thoroughfare, but it does mark the hypocenter of the detonation, which was some 600 meters above this point. There's a little tour group arriving, and there's a couple of things that I notice here. One, there's some very interesting light happening here. There's some shadows on the wall, and I'll talk to you more about the shadows just shortly. What I was actually waiting for was somebody to actually look up, because I was sure the tour guide would keep on saying 600 meters above this point, and by saying the word above, I thought somebody would look up. Interestingly, no one looked up, but that again is part of the story. Everybody's listening to the narrative and no one is looking up. I also went to the Peace Park and looked at the site of the A-bomb dome, and looked at some tourists interacting. This isn't part of my narrative or story, but I was interested to see the challenges that other people faced in photographing this very moving place in Japan. It's hard not to get very emotional when you're reading some of the plaques. So some tourists were doing selfies, sometimes with straight faces, sometimes with smiley faces, and it did occur to me that it is a challenging place to photograph. I wouldn't necessarily want to do a smiling selfie in front of a landmark which commemorates thousands of people losing their lives in a split second. So my shot of the A-bomb dome didn't actually have any people in it at all. I started being drawn because I was photographing around the 8:15, which was dawn at this time of the year. So I was drawn to the long shadows, and sometimes the only things left of people who had died during the detonation was the shadow of where they'd been standing. Very moving event again. So I started including shadows to try and get some way of communicating this story to other people. It also inspired me, because it is a historical event back in 1945, to start thinking about black and white. If you start pre-visualizing your story about how you want to treat it in post-production, that might help you think about how you actually photograph your subjects. So because I was thinking black and white now, I'm starting to be drawn between the light and the shade. And the trees are very powerful symbols of things that survived the atomic explosion. So because many trees did actually survive, even though not very many humans did. This was actually at 8:15, and I'm looking up now as the peace bell is sounding, and I'm trying to look up above the A-bomb dome to the point of detonation, which was another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Another thing that I wanted to photograph, and it's part of that detail, one of the 4 types of shots that helps to build a story, is the detail. And these are wishes and prayers that the Japanese will often tie to the branches of significant trees. And so some of these might be wishes for peace. I don't read Japanese, so I can only guess at what some of the wishes, what some of the messages on the folded pieces of paper tied to the trees actually say. Folding paper cranes is also another symbolic gesture in Hiroshima, and so to commemorate all of the children that died during the atomic explosion, there's this big statue of a girl who folded thousands of paper cranes before she died of leukemia. So this was another obviously key symbolic image into the narrative, and so you can see I'm trying to piece together pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that build that bigger picture. I wasn't too sure how to include people in a story where people perished, and so I tried to sideline them in many of the images that I was shooting rather than making them the center characters in the story. So for instance, my shot of the peace bell, it actually has somebody looking up into the bell itself, right in the bottom right hand corner. This is a very non-conventional compositional technique, sidelining your focal point. This was another shot that I actually was moved to put this in as one of the images that does feature the presence of humankind, and that is people respecting or paying or remembering the fallen, if you like. So again, this is captured because I was there over many days, and the key time for me was to be photographing around that 8:15 period. So I'm at the looking back now over the eternal flame, looking back to the A-bomb dome, and one of the park guards now is just bowing his head as the bell tolls. And for me, it's quite sort of spooky, if you like, quite moving, is the shadow coming off this this guard here is like the clock hand off that watch that we saw earlier. It's almost like he's acting as a sundial now to that moment in time. So I'm still looking for maybe my hero picture of the story, the sort of image that may be going double page spread that opens up the story in a magazine. So I was drawn back to this obelisk that is the commemorative statue, if you like, to the Hypo Center. Now this As I said, the lighting was very interesting because we're getting some interesting shadows falling on that wall, but the sun rising is being reflected off the windows behind me. So it's and the sunlight itself is not creating this, it's the sunlight reflected in the windows behind me. So if you're trying to map out the ideal time to be there for a shot, sometimes you might miss these types of shots because sometimes light behaves in unexpected ways. So this one was quite interesting with the character sort of made anonymous by that umbrella. So this one I thought was sort of working, but when I saw this shot, I realized this was the shot that I actually had been waiting for without even know I'd been waiting for it. The site here is the site of a medical center. It was actually the site of Hiroshima Hospital where the bomb detonated above. That wasn't the target. The target was actually two bridges forming a big, clearly identifiable T in the river, but obviously the bomb wasn't that accurate, so it detonated above Hiroshima Hospital. So having this guy in this white medical coat and this lanyard walking past the medical center at 8:15 in the morning created that big, powerful symbolic gesture that I was looking for in this story. Okay, let's move cities. We're going to Tokyo now. A lot of it's cherry blossom season, so that is obviously one of the stories that I captured. But I was looking for something that was perhaps less well visited by tourists, and I actually worked out from a fellow photographer who had been there a few years before that there is an opportunity to go and watch sumo wrestlers in training. These are younger, basically adolescents and younger men who are in training to become sumo wrestlers. And there is an opportunity for a small number of guests to go and watch these young men training each morning. So a little bit more difficult to arrange. It's not a completely tourist location, but it is possible to do this. So the first challenge is I can't move around like I normally move around. I had to be quiet and stay in one place. So I used two camera bodies with different focal lengths. The other challenging thing was the lighting was a little bit difficult. We've got some backlighting coming in from some windows that are quite high. This is quite cool skylight coming in, very blue. But this is, but it was quite awkward in that the main lighting in the interior of the building is fluorescent lighting. So we got some quite ugly color going on. And the other thing I noticed is if I dropped it to black and white, the backlighting, the room lighting, would really serve to help this story. Because these guys worked out so hard and their bodies were covered in the dirt of the dirt floor and also the sweat, I felt the backlight in black and white was going to be another great way of communicating what I was experiencing in this story. Most of my narratives are not black and white, but the story of Hiroshima and the sumo wrestlers, quite quickly I decided as I was shooting that these would work in black and white. And so we got these shots. I was drawn to one of the mirrors in the sumo stable because the sumo wrestlers themselves would periodically use this mirror, and the idea of a sumo wrestler interacting with their reflection I found as one of the key draw cards for my focus. But also the agility of the young men as well. A lot of people will see these very heavy young men and think that they're not actually very fit, and of course the opposite is true. They're almost like very large ballerinas, very balanced, poised, but also very powerful and very supple as well. So this, and again, just the sheer number of images to show their balance, their poise, their power, the effort they would put in to their training was again a way of building that bigger story. And here we can see some of the exertion going on the wrestlers, but also some of the more quieter moments, some of the more peaceful moments, which can create these very powerful portraits, which can again be the hero element of one of these stories. And sumo wrestlers posed for the visitors just at the end, but I didn't want them looking at camera for my shot, so I just went off at a slight angle, and again to use that rim lighting. Now, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about how I interact with people. A lot of people shoot landscape or astro because I think it's a way of avoiding photographing people. And when you do editorial, you realize quite quickly you can't avoid taking pictures of people. But it's not so scary once you've tried it, and you've done it a number of times. So you basically broken the ice, or you manage to lose that nervousness about photographing people who, until you start photographing them, are absolutely complete strangers. So I was actually teaching somebody photography on this ranch in Wyoming, and I went outside during one of the breaks, and there's a guy teaching other people how to work with horses, and he had a great face. This is Randy Ryman. I think he's a bit of a horse whisperer, really. He had a real way with horses, and so I asked him, or basically I told him that I was going to be taking photographs, so just to ignore me. But I did want him to pose for a couple of the photographs, so I got him with his horse, with some of the mountains in the background, which again creates sort of an establishing shot for the portrait series. But it's not just the one shot. If you're going to build a narrative, you're going to need to go in much closer. If you look at those classic hero shots for portraits, maybe while you're watching a Hollywood movie, you will come in really quite close for that head and shoulders look. You can either walk in or you can zoom in. This is all actually taken with a 100-400. I knew I wouldn't be getting too close as they were riding their horses, but when they were not riding the horses, there was an opportunity to go in and get some detail shots, because those detail shots are also very important to filling in the bigger picture for just a simple portrait of Randy there. And here he is in action on somebody else's horse, and with his dog in tow, and getting the horse to behave in just a few minutes of riding. So I would quickly switch from portrait mode into my action mode on the shoot mode dial. I think I talked to you about that earlier, how I can quickly move settings. So another opportunity I had when traveling in the USA, it was to one of the people I was staying with was going to pick up a piece of sculpture from a well-known sculptor, Jim Dolan, and so we went to his property to pick up the sculpture, and it was quite clear that there was a photo story here even before I met Jim, because this is the piece of sculpture that marks that you're about to enter onto his property. And because I'm interested in motorcycles, a big orangutan riding a chopped motorcycle, one that possibly couldn't actually ride anywhere, it's just a sculptural element, was a great introduction to Jim. So as I walk into his studios, I say hello to Jim, but I get him working again quite quickly with his welding gear, and he's working on this bison or buffalo sculpture, which he then informs me is going to form one of a herd of 101 bison. So I get Jim to walk me out to the bison as he's completing them. He's basically parking them in his backyard before he finds a more permanent location for this massive sculptural project he's got on the go. In talking to Jim, he becomes more comfortable with being photographed over an extended period of time. I use my open door technique to bring him to the door of his workshop. In the background there, we've got an old car which is going to be part of a sculpture of a horse riding over the top of this old car, which is another project he's working on. So that becomes part of that shadowy figure in the background there. And then Jim invites me to go up and take one of his big installations called the Blue Horses. So he takes me up at sunset, and we go and photograph all of these blue horses that overlook one of the freeways, and a great opportunity to take some more pictures of Jim and his work. And so quite quickly we can see we're building a body of work which tells a lot more about Jim than just a single portrait. Now, it is possible to interact with people over much shorter periods of time. I was invited to Malaysia to do a little bit of a workshop there, and I was going to be a keynote speaker at one of the talks. And at one of the location shoots the next day, we had this opportunity to go to a tea shop in Ipoh, and I talked to the guy who was making us tea. And again, I used that open door technique. I photographed him making tea, but I also got him to walk out towards the doorway, because there was a great shot looking back into the shop where they sold and made tea. And so again, getting in a little bit closer. He's looking off camera. Sometimes I'll invite him to look down the barrel of the lens and keep on talking, getting in even closer for a very powerful portrait. I put a little inset in there because in between these portrait shoots he was making me endless cups of tea. So to show you how you can actually learn how to interact with people, is I never photograph people if they're aware that I'm photographing without first acknowledging that we've made eye contact without the camera there. If I am photographing somebody at a distance and I see that they notice the camera, I immediately drop the camera from my eye so that I can smile at them and wave at them. The action of just smiling at a complete stranger and waving at them is quite disarming. The first thing that most people will think is, do I know that person? And so they'll often smile and wave back. So this is a woman in Singapore who's smiling at me because I'm on the other side of the road waving and smiling at her. So she's quite pleased that I'm smiling. I'm sort of making her day. But I move closer, and it's quite clear that she's comfortable with me taking photographs, so I'm moving ever closer, and you can see her face starting to relax because I'm not smiling and waving anymore. And this is the shot that I actually want, that really powerful shot where I've moved in quite close, well, it's almost as close as I can go with the 85mm 1.8, even cropping into the top of the head. And if you watch those Hollywood movies, you'll see that is a close crop, is we often crop into the top of the head because we've moved in so close. And these portraits become very powerful as the eyes become the focus point of the image. If you're a bit nervous about just waving at complete strangers in the street, there are opportunities to almost get into the rhythm of photographing people that you've only met for a few seconds. One of my pieces of advice is to go maybe to a working museum. This is a place called Sovereign Hill where people get dressed up in period clothes. Now they're actually paid to dress up in clothes and have their pictures taken by tourists. So if you go up to them and say, can I take your picture, they're not going to say no because that is their job. And so sometimes you might have to remind these people they don't need to smile. You can have a conversation with them if they still look a little bit awkward in the shot, and within a minute or two of just chatting to them about what they do at the museum, they will start to relax. Now, I'm usually using wide apertures so I can defocus the backgrounds, but ever so occasionally I'll ask somebody just to move slightly so I get better lighting and a better background. Here I'm getting the converging lines, the leading lines of the street disappearing into the distance to help me here. But I might also walk people back out of the sun into open shade, into a doorway, so I get that nice dark background. And here are some of the ways that I'm doing. Even on a sunny day, I can work with the ambient light using window light or door light to get these classic portraits that I like shooting. I returned there just recently when I was reviewing the Alpha 7R4 camera, and Sony Singapore requested vertical portraits. Most of my portraits are actually captured in horizontal, sometimes referred to as landscape format, but because I knew that they wanted quite narrow verticals, I went back to Sovereign Hill to get some more character portraits, this time shooting 16:9 aspect ratio verticals in order to give files that were big enough so Sony Singapore could print them bigger than 6 feet tall, so they were life-size portraits of these people to show the resolution capabilities of the Alpha 7R4 camera. And just to show you how big they were actually printed, these are the evidence of those images being printed up in Singapore here. Okay, so another way of interacting with people in a way that is very enjoyable is to go to a parade. People often get dressed up to go to a parade, and if they spend all day at the parade and no one photographs them, you might think that they will go home slightly disappointed that maybe they didn't make enough effort to dress up in an outrageous fashion so that people would want to photograph them. So, and I will approach people. Sometimes you get people who may be a little bit cold, and I can usually pick that up in a few seconds, but if I smile at them and they smile back, it's game on, and I will basically take 10, 20, 30 portraits and ever getting closer and closer, and they will ham it up for me, and I will usually get the shot that I'm looking for. As you can see from these pictures on this parade, I'll usually go to a Pride parade or a Mardi Gras each year to get these beautiful portraits, and I'll come back with hundreds and hundreds of these portraits, and you will lose your fear of approaching strangers. You will notice that ever so occasionally one gives you a grumpy look, and you just pass them on by and go to the next 10 people who want to interact with you and get your photographs. And so I've got lots and lots of these photographs. The other thing that I will do is there's another important day in Australia. It's called Anzac Day. It's to remember the fallen in the wars, and that is a great opportunity for young and old to get together to remember these people. And I will use this as an opportunity to take a whole lot of portraits. And as you can see, because I go each year, typically I will take a different lens each year to get a different style of portrait, and you may have seen many of these portraits that I showcase for particular technical exercise like grabbing focus or using IAF, or just to showcase a particular lens. But some of the shots you may not have seen in those portraits are actually the surrounding pieces, the detail shots, the establishing shots, the activity shots that I'm also shooting whilst taking the portrait shots as well. So another thing that I will do is go to demonstration as well. Now, media photographers will go to a demonstration, so it's pretty much game on. Anyone who goes to the demonstration, they know they're trying to get their message out, so being photographed is a way to get the message out. And so I will often go to these demonstrations to basically take these portraits, but also tell the bigger picture and try and put forward the message that the people are demonstrating about. So this is something I often refer to as Invasion Day. Australia has a commemorative day called Australia Day, but it's not a happy commemorative experience for everyone, because it's dated around the arrival of the first fleet, which is European settlement of Australia, which sort of removes the 40,000 plus years of inhabitation by the indigenous peoples of Australia. So there has been these demonstrations every year on Australia Day, so the indigenous people can put forward their message as well. There was a message to move the day and maybe not to celebrate it at all until the indigenous communities basically get equal rights and obviously I'm not there to do the politics. I'm just there to put forward what is actually happening at this event. Sometimes people will criticize me thinking I'm making a political statement, but I'm here not to actually make a statement other than to showcase what actually happened on this day. And because I don't often write words with these articles now, they're just picture stories, and so you can take from the stories what you will. Obviously the editing process will sort of give you an idea of my standpoint on a particular event. For instance, I'm quite clear to showcase powerful people at these events, people who don't need your sympathy but certainly need your respect, and so that is maybe the what I can communicate just through the editing process. Another way of interacting with people to get more comfortable in this space is the genre of photography called street photography. Now, a lot of people are afraid of getting into street photography because they're a bit of afraid of negative reactions that they might get from people who get angry, who are aware that they've had their photograph taken and you didn't ask their permission. So I just talked to you about how I managed to do this with, I don't remember the last time I had any negative reaction doing street photography. And the way this happens is I choose the space first. I've chosen this particular space, for instance, because of the shadow of the tree going over the walls here. So because I'm here first and I'm quite clearly set up, anybody who walks into shot sees that I was here first. So they get the impression that they've stepped into maybe an urban landscape where they're an unwanted presence, where actually they're the focal point of the image that I'm actually wanting. And so a lot of people will often apologize or move quickly, or if they're coming in from the side of the shot, walk around the back of me, in which case I will just wave them in front of the camera and then take their picture anyway. Sometimes I will use silent shooting mode on the cameras so that they're actually not aware, and I don't have the camera to my face. Often it will be at waist level, and I'm often using the thumb rather than my forefinger to depress the shutter release, and sometimes I'm not looking at them or the camera. Now, this particular location I've chosen, I'm not panning with the guy descending the stairs. He's basically walking into my stage that I've set up. And we're getting that lighting that I've also noticed that I used in Hiroshima, which is also happening here. You'll see the person on the right has two shadows, one from the rising sun, one from the reflected sun of the windows behind me. So I picked this location for the lighting and then allowed people to walk through the shots. This was a location I found in Melbourne. I set up and I was attracted by the colours and the shadows, and I was waiting there for like 10 or 15 minutes and no one walked through my shot. It was a bit of a secluded area in Melbourne that I'd found here, but there was a taxi rank off to my right, so I was quite cheeky and I just walked up to the cab in the taxi rank and asked the driver if he would just walk through my shot. He was a little bit confused as to what I wanted him to do, but when he saw a couple of the example shots on the back of the camera, he knew exactly what I was trying to achieve, and basically it's that shadow on the orange wall there. Another way of getting unnoticed by people in the street genre is just to take a vantage point that is slightly higher. Most people don't look up, as you could see from that Hiroshima obelisk, the hypocenter there. Most people don't make a habit of looking up, and so if you're photographing on a bridge or an overpass, generally you will go unnoticed. So I'm looking down. The other advantage of me looking down in this particular shot is I'm taking out the sky, which would be a distraction. It goes back to my cityscape shots where immediate foreground and skylines are something that will just add information that I don't need. So for me, this is about a story of two elements, the human and the bridge in Yokohama. And again, looking down is we can get just interesting perspectives on pedestrians in the streets. We're going to look at the sort of gear that I use when I'm traveling, because I think if you go out laden with gear, and I'm talking more than 7 kilograms, more than 15, 16, 17 pounds worth of photography gear, this could be a way that you may lose your passion for photography, because some days you'll feel more like a pack mule than a photographer. Now this photograph was taken by the editor of Australian Photography magazine, and when I saw that he'd posted in the magazine, I said, "Oh, look, you've got a nice picture of me in the center on this shot." And he said, "How do you know you're the one in the center?" And I said, "I'm not the one carrying the very large tripod and the backpack." And he looked over it and he go, "Oh yes, everybody's carrying large tripods and backpacks." Now, the tripods aren't necessary. We've scaled the Cervantes sand dunes, and so the need for a tripod has basically disappeared. There was an opportunity for everybody to put their tripods in the four-wheel drives before we clambered up the side of the sand dune, but some people feel linked or attached to their tripods, so those come along for the journey. And the other thing is, I only take enough gear for what I think I need, and that will usually fit in a small messenger bag rather than a backpack. So to give you some examples, the gear that I put in a messenger bag and the type of messenger bag changes a lot. I have lots of different messenger bags, but this is one example. For instance, we've got the crop sensor Alpha 6600 camera with the two excellent G glass lenses here, so we can go from an equivalent 24mm full frame equivalent 24 to 525 millimeters. So even though I'm going up maybe up a sand dune, I'm basically covering all of my bases here. Normally I might want to take a wide aperture prime as well, but you can see the this gear just weighs 2.5 kilos, and with the steady shot inside I can pretty much handheld very low light shots, so definitely won't need the tripod in this instance. If I was carrying full frame, I might have to increase the size of the messenger bag. This is a 3-lens kit. There's a 100-400 lens poking out the end there. Sometimes it's the 70-200, and we may have one zoom and one prime in there. One of my favorite tripods is a tripod that most people won't consider owning, and that is a tripod that is very, very short and very, very light. This is the Leo Photo Carbon LS223 tripod. The major drawback of using a tripod this small is you can't shoot at eye height or waist height even, but then 90% of my landscapes are shot very low to the ground, because I do like introducing foreground into my landscape shots when using the 16-35 ultra wide angle lenses. So there's a couple of ideas about how to travel much lighter with your gear than maybe what you're currently traveling with. So the next thing is maybe if you're just leaving home for a day, is to consider the one lens approach. I will often go out and cover an event with one camera, one lens, maybe a spare battery. That's all I take. And so this particular invasion day, I shot just with the 85 1.4. Not only did I use one camera and one lens, I only ever left it on one aperture, which was f1.4. It's a great way of just basically simplifying your workflow for the day and forcing you to explore the limits and capabilities of just using one lens at one aperture. This is the FE 100mm lens on Anzac Day, and I shot this all at f2.8. And this was a day, celebration day again in Melbourne, where a lot of people would dress up, and I shot all of this event with the FE135 G Master lens, all at f1.8. So it's my one lens, one camera, one aperture approach. And one of the lovely things about shooting with an APS-C camera, it's very small, just using a wrist strap. I'll often carry the FE85 1.8 on that crop sensor camera, and I'll shoot at maximum aperture, and it behaves like a 135 full frame lens at f2.8 depth of field equivalent. And so with the really reliable IAF using this combination, I can grab portrait street photographs very quickly without basically making people aware that I'm actually at work. Now let me talk to you about some other opportunities for keeping your interest in photography alive. And one of the ways for doing that is organizing your vacations or your holidays around possible photographic opportunities. My wife often says we don't go on holidays, we have photographic opportunities, and I have to agree that is exactly what I do. So I've actually come to a dinner dance. It's a tourist event. These dancers are dancing for tourists in Bali, but my photography started before the dance because I know the dancers will have to get ready for the dance, and I know Balinese dancers will put a lot of makeup on and they'll wear very fancy dress. And so I just asked the waiter, could I actually photograph the dancers getting ready for the dance? And so this became my photo shoot, not the dance itself. So admittedly it was very low light. They were getting made up with just a single low watt globe here. So the ISO went through the ceiling here. We were often dealing with ISO values 12,800 and sometimes even higher. But I got the shots that I wanted of these dancers getting ready for the dance. Another event that I started doing was every time I go back to Bali, Bali is the closest international location next to New Zealand for me to travel to, and so it's a popular vacation spot for Australians. But I don't go to always, in fact I rarely go to the standard tourist locations. What I will often do is just talk to the waiters and waitresses and hotel staff about opportunities that are happening in their homes, their villages, their towns, which are just natural celebrations or festivals that are not tourist put on for tourists. They're just happening because they're annual events for themselves. And so at this particular event there's 500 women in the locality who are dancing, and it's not staged for tourists. So, and I was actually my wife and myself were the only tourists watching these 500 women dance. So even just around the hotel that I'm staying, I could have wildlife opportunities. For instance, this is one of my wildlife shots that I captured whilst drinking a cup of coffee, would you believe, watching these monkeys groom themselves. The tourists haven't yet arrived at the monkey sanctuary or forest, and so they're sort of having a bit of downtime before there's stuff to steal from the tourists. And so, but again, with my photographic workflow, getting in close, getting the detail shots as well as the portraits, and so we're sort of mixing it up. We're getting the four aspects of the shots there. Photographing them in the rain, see what they do in the rain. Photographing, I actually watched this monkey being born and then being nursed for the very first time. The whole world evolving just on the fence opposite to where I get coffee every morning. And just as I thought I could never match a shot as funny as this one, a couple of years later I went back and got this shot, just showing you there's always an opportunity to get a shot as good or better than a shot that you might not think you'll be able to beat. So going out each time to events that are happening. This was a tooth filing ceremony, again not for tourists. We would just make a small donation to the family to thank them. We would share the photographs that I'm taking with the family, again as a way of thanking them for including basically what are outsiders to a very family event. The tooth filing is a pretty weird event, I have to say. This young man can't really get married until he's had his pointy teeth filed flat, would you believe? believe. And so, and I'm invited to be very, very close. I was sort of staying at a respectful distance to the actual tooth filing, but I was invited very, very close, almost like join hands with the rest of the family as this young man had his teeth filed. This is opposite ends of the spectrum now. A young child having its head shaved for its naming day ceremony down by a river at a temple, and sort of before and after hair event here, and the family really embraced me to have capture their images. The father with this beautiful soft light, and some of the maybe cousins and brothers, just interacting with their elder sisters or family members. So really just shooting everything, just not focusing on what you think is the hero element, but just looking around you all of the time and just going with the flow. One of my most interesting events, and the manager of the hotel I was staying was very excited to be able to invite me to this one, which it's a cremation ceremony, and it's a very long event that happens over 3-4 days. And so this is almost like the hero shot in that cremation, but it started days before that, and that's the preparation of the corpse. Lots of praying, lots of religious people coming to the household, getting the detail shots of the ceremonial knives, the ceremonial ducks, the ceremonial offerings, the food offerings, getting the family members praying in the family courtyard. I got through so many thousands of photographic images. Here is just these few that I'm highlighting here, just show you just a snapshot of what I'm doing. The ceremony moved to a different temple down by a river, so again offerings have to be carried, this time by the women, down to this temple, and carrying the portraits of the deceased. This is a school teacher who had passed away. The holy man who conducts or is in charge of the ceremonies, he had quite an interesting interaction with me. He allowed himself to be taken many times as the days unfolded. So I took photographs of him getting dressed up in his ceremonial clothing, going through the very complex ceremonies. On the day of the cremation itself, a big construction arrived at the family home. The coffin, if you like, was placed into the structure, and then it was carried through the streets on the way to the cremation ground. And so I took pictures of people who were carrying this big structure, and also the spectators that basically stopped traffic on the way to the cremation ground. Obviously he was a school teacher, so the whole school turned out on the way to the cremation ground to pay their respects. And then the actual cremation service itself. And at the cremation ground there were hundreds and hundreds of people basically partaking in the cremation services, and there were 0 tourists. This was very much a way of getting inside the Balinese culture and documenting this, and I felt like I was not intruding because I was invited, and I was basically the event photographer, if you like. I made all of my photographs available to the family for free as to pay thanks for them including me in the event. And just finally, some people will say, Mark, you have great gear, so you can do things that we can't. So I just wanted to show you how this my approach to this narrative style of photography is possible, even when you're using some basic equipment such as maybe the Pocket RX100. And so when I was working in Vietnam for Sony Singapore to promote the use of the RX100. We were taken to many locations, but this is just a narrative that I did over 2 visits to this location of a fishing village. So again, detail shots along the beach. Obviously the day starts at the first light of day. I found some people around the campfire, challenging with a small sensor camera, but not impossible. Some of the characters who walk down to the beach at the first light of day. the first fishing boat that I encountered coming back into the beach and being dragged up the beach, a fisherman mending his nets, the tractor that has to come down the beach to collect the fishing boat, to drag it up to the back of the beach. Again, I know nothing about the lives of these fishermen. I can only just pay attention, follow the activity, take pictures, maybe ask questions at the time, maybe ask questions later, so I can understand what is unfolding here. And of course, the characters themselves, the fishermen and their families who build up the character of this fishing village. And again, detail shots of the fish themselves, some action shots, this guy pushing the fishing boat, being splashed by big waves, trying to get the small boat onto the beach itself. Maybe going out to sea, lots of activity, prepared to get my own feet wet in the process as the incoming waves come in, and of course the big, wider, maybe the hero shot that Sony will use to promote this camera. If you've enjoyed this story, you're probably aware that I've got lots of movies on my Mark Gators Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel about working with the cameras that you're currently working with. There's my website, of course, where you're free to download any of the resources and then just donate what you think they're worth to you. And a lot of my Patreon members will be watching this particular video, and so they're aware of the tiers that I offer, which are the $5, $10 and the $50 tiers for premium or platinum services that I offer. So hopefully you've enjoyed that very long extended story about me photographing narratives, and which is I attribute to keeping my photographic passion alive for 40 years, not collecting hero shots that have got a lot of likes on social media. Half of my career has been spent with no social media. So what has driven me was photography being a window to the world for me to get out, explore and interact. And that people element of my narratives has been instrumental in basically that interaction, so I can learn and document, and I have a reason to be there because I'm taking photographs. Okay, catch you online next time.